Okay, greetings everybody. I think we should get started with panel 2 and make sure that we can engage with everybody there. So welcome back. It's already been such a rich set of sessions that we've had today with a keynote and then the first panel. In this second panel, we're going to turn our attention to ethics and artificial intelligence, which is a really important but very big topic. And so I'm thrilled that we are joined today by 3 outstanding speakers. You can see their details on the screen. Just for any avoidance of ambiguity, there's 2 Emmas. I'm currently showing on the left of your screen, so I'm Dr. Emma Harden-Wolfson. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at McGill University in Canada, and I fairly recently joined McGill, having come from UNESCO, where one of the most recent things I did was work on a major new project on artificial intelligence, including a lot of work on ethics. So it's with that kind of hat on and that expertise that I'll be able to join the panel. However, today is not about the work that we've done there, although hopefully we can share some links to a new publication that we have out from UNESCO. What I'd like to turn to, though, more importantly, is the 3 speakers that we have here with us today. So we're going to take up these kind of broader questions about what ethical challenges does generative AI pose for education, and what could just an ethical research and policy responses look like. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our speakers to respond to a question that relates to their own kind of work and areas of expertise in the ethics of AI. And then we'll do sort of another round, at which point, we'll also be collecting questions and comments that you have if you're listening in, and we will keep some time at the end of the panel to take those up as well. So we're going to go straight in, and I'm going to turn first to the other Emma in the room. So this is Professor Emma Houtkamp-Bloem, who is the professor and head of the Department of Philosophy in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Emma is the Ethics of AI lead at the Centre for Artificial Intelligence Research, and as of last week, is also the chair of the UNESCO World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. So we should also warmly congratulate Emma for this outstanding achievement. Emma, are you there? Because I don't quite see everybody. You are. Excellent. Brilliant. All right. Very good. Very good. Okay. So can you kick us off? And I'm going to ask you to speak for, 3 to 5 minutes. Make sure that we have, enough time to get around to everybody. So, Emma, what would you say, what would the main elements of an ethical and just policy approach to AI in education be? So over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I think the first thing that I want to say is, at the back of our minds, when we think about an approach, let alone the policy, is that, in fact, the landscape of digital technologies that is structured by inequities, biases, and potential and actual harm is, in fact, a reflection of the real world. And we have measures in place to navigate the real world. So, we shouldn't be freaked out by the hype, should be very much aware of the hype. And we should rather just be calm and then, as educators, revisit why and what and how we learn. And then take up the challenge to reflect on the long-term implications of generative AI applications in education for the creation and the acquisition and validation, specifically maybe the validation of knowledge. And we should make the best of educators being the world's most knowledgeable authorities on the teaching of reasoning and writing. If you think of a framework for this kind of approach or for a policy, it's not really very useful to think only in terms of values and principles. One should always think, how will you actualize these values and principles in terms of policy actions? But in terms of values, maybe quickly, I'm thinking of social values such as interconnectedness. Harming one means harming all, specifically in the context of education. Values such as equity and inclusivity and human agency. And then maybe what I call human rights values, such as transparency and accountability. You have the right to know if an AI system took a decision about you, and obviously accountability. And then research values in this context, such as honesty and integrity. And these can play out in terms of actions such as identifying shared concerns about the impact of generative AI on the cultivation of autonomous reasoning skills, conducting impact assessments to determine what is needed in your region of the world to enable inclusive and meaningful participation in generative AI, and promoting plural opinions and plural expressions of ideas. The plurality here is so important for all the reasons I already mentioned in the panel, and I'll say maybe a few words about that later if I have the chance. But yeah, we have to fight about any kind of hegemony in this context, and in teaching students the value of engaging in robust and trustworthy knowledge production. They should understand that there is an enjoyment about this, and there are rewards about this. And then very quickly, part of such a framework would be monitoring and validating the use of generative AI in education and the development of critical AI competencies. So building awareness and skill in engaging with generative AI, helping students develop a critical awareness of generative machine models, how they work, why their content is often biased, false or simplistic, what their social, intellectual, and environmental implications might be. So contextualize in terms of social impact, help them to reflect on the racial implications of automated decision-making, on increasing carbon footprint of cloud computing, on the long histories of technological change, and the dangerous stereotypes that internet data amplifies. Obviously, we need to build capacity then for teachers and researchers to make proper use of generative AI and to transfer these kind of critical AI competencies, and encourage intrinsic motivation so that students feel connected to their learning and their writing. So a very good guidance and start document to think about all of this is the newly released UNESCO guidance for the use of generative AI in education and research that has been referred to already, which is a human-centered approach to AI. And the most important to emphasize quickly, and then I'll stop, is that the use of AI should be at the service of the development of human capabilities for inclusive, just, and sustainable futures. So what is the goal of using AI in education? The goal is to build inclusive, just, and sustainable futures. So the goal is not for AI to take over. The goal is to use AI so that we can build these kinds of futures. And then obviously we have to be guided by human rights standards and principles, and the need to protect human dignity and the cultural diversity that defines the knowledge commons, or that should define the knowledge commons. Thank you.
That's a really fantastic opening response. Thank you so much. And, great to hear that recent UNESCO guidance being brought out as well. But also, this idea about not just the what, but the why, right, for artificial intelligence. So thank you so much for that. We're going to turn now to Raïssa Malu. Raïssa is a directrice of Investing in People, ASBL, which is a nonprofit association in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So welcome, Raïssa. And a question for you, which I think really leads very nicely from the comments that we've just had. Can you tell us about how you believe that ethical frameworks for AI in education can be adapted to suit the unique cultural and linguistic diversity of French-speaking Africa? And I feel very conscious that I've just asked you that question in English. So I think we're running in English today, but perhaps, never mind. Anyway, Raïssa, welcome to the panel, and over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Can you hear me well?
Beautifully.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for the question. The challenge is to make sure that AI systems contribute to a more inclusive, or more sustainable, or more peaceful world. UNESCO have just said that risks associated with AI have already begun to compound on top of existing inequalities. In the specific case of French-speaking African countries, there are many issues, but let's take the most obvious one, the language barrier. Technologies are developed in English. They are more readily available in English-speaking and industrialized countries. And here, to overcome this difficulty, our first reflex is to make the teaching of English compulsory in our schools. And sometimes we even make a radical decision by changing the country official language to English. Of course, it's important to learn an international language like English, but let's the case of the DRC, which is officially the largest French-speaking country in the world. The majority of Congolese only use French at school and for administrative tasks. And yet, according to majority assessment we carried out, our students and teachers don't even reach the minimum level of proficiency in French. So as French is mostly not mastered, imposing English doesn't seem like a good idea. But as recommended is in the first ever global standard on AI ethics produced by UNESCO in 2021, online courses and digital resources and platforms should be developed and available in French, but in local and indigenous languages. This work should be carried out in collaboration with local people, linguists, and cultural experts who can provide guidance on language nuances, preferences, or sensitivities. So AI-generated content should not only be translated, but culturally adapted. And also in our region, which are rich oral traditions, we also need to explore innovative ways to integrate oral storytelling into AI-driven educational materials. And I believe that African researchers and developers in our French-speaking countries should be encouraged, supported, and empowered to develop such tools. And also, I was recently watching a French debate on the French TV on the replacement of jobs by AI. And one of the speakers gave one of advantages of using AI. He said that for people who make spelling, grammar mistakes and who therefore have difficulties accessing certain jobs, thanks to generative AI, they can perform those tasks where they were limited and thus see their possibility expanded. They would no longer be limited by their current lack of technical skills. I think it's quite fine, even if the French teacher wouldn't be too happy. But for us here in Africa, this is exactly what we need for our population, but with local languages and voice recognition. This is about adapting technology to local context and cultures. The second crucial point is community engagement, inviting educators, parents, students, and community leaders to discuss, to provide input, to provide feedbacks that ethical guidelines align with local values, concerns, and needs. So we still need to meet people through physical contact while at the same time organizing online activities. But by taking into account our region, with varying level of digital access, we foster a sense of ownership and trust in AI-powered education. Thank you, Emma.
Lisa, thank you so much. I think that really has helped us to see some of the nuances. Immediately comes to my mind some of the points you're making about, society, communities where there are stronger oral traditions compared to how artificial intelligence has been developed based on written corpuses. That alone I will just take up as one of the issues, which I think would be really interesting, if we can pick that up in more detail. So thank you so much for those excellent opening remarks. Okay, let's turn now to our third speaker. So Dr. Janja Komljenovic is a senior lecturer in education at Lancaster University in the UK. Janja, welcome. Let me start by kind of zooming back out a little bit. And if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the more macro level concerns with generative AI in education that you see. So Janja, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Emma. So following the excellent keynote and the wonderful debates of the previous panel, I'll think a little bit more broadly about AI. So what I will mention is relevant for generative AI, but also more broadly. And some of the key concerns that I see are around user consent. So where individual users have to agree to all terms and conditions unilaterally issued typically by proprietary platforms or various contracts that platforms have with their education institutions, etc. So there's a question of user agency there. The second key concern that I see is around user data beyond personal data and lack of regulation. And even where there is data privacy regulation, it is not sufficient to actually address inferences and decisions based on data processing. So we see that personal data might be legally collected, but what kind of inferences are made based on personal data calculations and with what impact is not really addressed. There's also a lack of democratic and relational decision making. So most analytics and targeted interventions actually put individuals in groups and therefore in relation to each other. But it is not really known to users why, with what impact, and they have no influence on it. And there's also asymmetry in power of who is able to make digital user data valuable. Is it educational institutions or individuals or proprietary platform companies? And by this, I mean both who profits from it financially, but also who decides on what kind of data products get integrated into various kinds of digital platforms and who determines the course of innovation. So based on my research and recently finished research project, we recently published a policy proposal for discussion in UK, but I think it's equally applicable everywhere, really. And the proposal for discussion, I think one of the key issues for this debate here would be that we propose discussing setting up data trust, a sectorial data trust, where all user data, personal and other, would be collected and governed there. This would separate actually the data production and data control sites. So in other words, those who collect data, including proprietary platforms, would not necessarily also be the only controllers of the data and use it for their monetization and benefit. And such a governance structure could be set up that would foster ethical and just innovation, but also set standards for user rights and user contribution to decision making. So I'm quite concerned with collective and democratic decision making here and how we can actually make that work, as Emma mentioned before as well. As various kinds of AI operations actually need data, education data trusts could also set the rules of the game. So what are the rules to access data? What kind of products can be developed? Should commercial actors pay for it? And so on. And obviously, this cannot be done overnight. It would take some years to develop, but it's really key to think this through. And if I can just conclude by reflecting also on generative AI specifically in education, it doesn't seem to me to be enough to leave it to users, to education institutions or individuals, so whoever is responsible, to pick on the market and do their homework about how these generative AI tools function. Harini in previous panel talked about opaqueness of how data is collected to develop large language models and how the process is untransparent. So what kind of democratic governance structure do we need to scrutinize the process of designing as well as evaluation in such specific sectors like education, and at what scales? So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Janja, and my congratulations to all the panel for keeping within the time that we'd suggested for this first round of questions. But I think, Janja, you've really brought some important questions around the governance, right, of AI at different levels. And perhaps, again, you could, if you have the opportunity, talk to us a bit more about this concept of data trusts and how, that might connect then with some of the concerns also raised by Emma and Raïssa in their first questions as well. So Emma, if I can come back to you at this point, I think actually, we've talked to Janja's sort of, leading us towards perhaps some of the way forward. And I think with your work, Emma, at UNESCO and in your institute, you're also, really thinking about how do we grapple with this. So with that in mind, could you talk to us a bit about what you see as some of the biggest obstacles for attaining the ethical and just policy approach to AI and education that you laid out for us?
Yes, thank you. The first one is digital poverty, and related to that is the reduction of diversity of opinions and further marginalization of already marginalized voices. So in terms of digital poverty, we have to acknowledge that the possibility to create and control generative AI is out of reach of most companies and most countries, especially those in the global south, because of the huge amounts of data and massive computing power at issue. And so there is a risk of data colonizing, and the previous panel already referred to this in various ways. So the risk of being colonized by the standards that are embedded in the large language models, and which mainly reflect the values and norms of the global north. So it is important that researchers and educators and learners take a critical view of the value orientations and cultural standards and social customs that are embedded in the training models and that also come out in what is generated. And then obviously this, in terms of the reduction of the diversity of opinions, it is really important to understand that data poor populations will have minimal or limited digital presence online. And so they will really appear, and their values will really appear in the outputs that are generated. So a critical assessment of what is generated cannot be stressed enough, and always asking how minority voices could have been left out here, what is not being heard, not only looking at what is generated, but also searching for what you think could have been left out. And that's something that I think is really important to teach to students. Then there is this issue of AI, and specifically where we are at the moment with generative AI, the issue of outpacing regulation. So we need to understand that there is kind of a Wild West at the moment. There's a lot being done in terms of the EU AI Act and the UNESCO recommendation and so on. But there is still a very severe lack of appropriate regulation. And this links to legal concerns. So we know that there are several ongoing international legal cases against the violation of intellectual property rights specifically, but also ownership rights to the produced text-based narratives by the generative AI applications. The unexplainable models that are used to generate output, these models are not transparent in general. They're not explainable. So they operate as black boxes. So it's difficult to know why particular content has been created. And so it's difficult to detect bias, but you should be aware that there is bias somewhere. So again, it's the critical attitude that's needed. Explosion of misinformation is another obstacle. So AI-generated content polluting the internet. If untruthful or incorrect generated text is posted online, you will not only mislead other humans, but also other generative AI algorithms that are trained on this text. And this is a real problem. So it is important to also consider long-term issues that will potentially arise for the reliability of knowledge, which brings me to another obstacle, which is thinking about the nature and the status of the generated knowledge. This is not even genuinely novel content that is being generated. Because these applications are not informed by observations of the real world or key aspects of scientific method, or it's not aligned with human or social values. So again, the critical approach is at the bottom of everything. The same with another obstacle that everybody thinks about, but sometimes always gets left out because we think in terms of natural language processing and text-based generative AI, but there's of course also the generative AI in terms of computer vision. So people need to be aware that any images that they share on the internet could be incorporated in generative AI training data and might be manipulated in various ways. And then lastly, really important, and it has also been touched on in the previous panel, this surveillance capitalism business model of AI. We have to be aware that this kind of business model is about data commodification for profit, and that the fact, therefore, that these systems produce answers that sound correct and intelligent to humans is perhaps the most dangerous threat to human agency and mental integrity and non-discrimination in the AI context to date. Thank you.
Excellent. I think you could probably list many more obstacles given the opportunity, but I think you raised some of the really, really critical ones. I will just share that at UNESCO, the institute that I was working at was contacted a lot by people saying, "Listen, we're really worried about artificial intelligence, and this is in the domain of higher education. What do we do?" And it seems to me that actually one of the most important things that we can do if we're educating students in that context is work with the students on critical thinking. And that seems to resonate with a lot of what you've just been saying in terms of, constantly asking. And I really liked the point that you made as well about, say, what is not being heard. We've always got to be mindful of that, not just dealing with the issues that we have with the data that's in these generative AI systems and the data it's spitting out, but what isn't there and why isn't that there. So thank you so much again for that. Raïssa, here we're going to ask, turn back to you as well, and think, again, in this specific context that you're grounded in, and whether there are any specific ethical guidelines or principles that you found effective in your work in integrating AI tools in education in the DRC that you could share with us, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to share three guidelines, three principles, and finish with a thought. Between 2019 and 2021, we tested within the Ministry of Primary, Secondary, and Technical Education here in DRC a virtual tutor to assess the mathematical learning of students in the first 2 years of secondary schools and provide real-time remediation activities. The test was carried out in 6 of the country provinces involving around 20 schools. This was done as part of a World Bank project, a World Bank funded project. I was managing the project with this. The first phase consisted in adapting this virtual tutor called MyTwiz, developed by an English company, to the French language, to our new mathematics curricula, and to our cultural specificities. This was a fundamental step. We couldn't allow the tool to be used in our schools if this stage hadn't been carried out with the tools developers and with local ministry education teams. In this way, we were able to reinforce local capacities of the ministry teams and ensure that the tool was best adapted to our local context. Of course, it took time, it took resources, but it was not negotiable. During the test phase, we were confronted with another difficulty: fear. Fear stemming from teachers, a lack of digital skills, fear of change, fear of being replaced, fear of having too much work, fear of technology, and so on. What's more, the period of the test fell during the COVID-19 pandemic. So schools were closed. The education system was disrupted, like but the project objective had to be met. So to counteract fear, we use patience and empathy. A member of the team has been dedicated to training teachers both on site and remotely to address any concerns that they may have. We set up a WhatsApp group to stay connected, to continue distance training, to encourage teachers to continue their assessment with the virtual tutor, because the virtual tutor was made to assess children, but also the teacher. And we also encourage local mutual aid. When a teacher or school principal made a concrete proposal for the test to continue, we support the initiative in any way we could. So the image I always use is that our strategy was to start by holding teachers by the hands with patience and respect, and to make sure that they can use the tool and the test could continue. So while the test went relatively well, questions and concerns remain. It was also important to reinforce the training of inspectors and ministry authorities so that the data generated could be used to improve teaching quality and governance. Teachers, schools, ministry authorities had access to the data, but no one was interested. So for me, the third guidelines is to continue developing a scientific and technological culture among all stakeholders in all spheres of society, rural and urban, educated or not, even with PhDs. Otherwise, people won't be able to contribute to the necessary ethical debate about AI and about all this technology. But, and I will finish with that, technology is not a panacea. the many problems facing our countries will not be solved solely by more technology or by more efficient technology. Sometimes I get the impression that we are not asking ourselves the right questions. Sometimes there are obvious things that we don't want to see or hear. I'm just putting that here. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you again, Raïssa. Really interesting and intriguing point that you've left us with about we're not always asking the right questions. Hopefully we are getting to some of them in this panel. But I think, again, your responses really help us to kind of realize, what does it actually mean when we're talking about generative AI? It's important to talk about it in a kind of bigger context, but also to, for you to share those experiences that you've had of actually implementing it. And I think particularly interesting to see that the thing that worked the most successfully was actually the human encounter, whether that was done, over a WhatsApp group or if it was done in person. So, thank you for sharing that. That's really important. Janja, let's turn to you, and then I can see we've already got some great questions coming in from the many, many people who are here with us today. Janja, if education is one of many, if not all, social and economic sectors that's being impacted by generative AI at the moment, how would you connect education specifically, and how does that relate to this kind of overall AI dynamic? Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, thanks, Emma. So until a domain-specific generative AI model or several models are developed, it seems that the most successful generic ones, such as ChatGPT by OpenAI, will be used in education. And Amber in the previous panel mentioned how education specifics are not really discussed in this sort of general innovation. So education is huge as a sector, globally in terms of the number of students. If I'm not mistaken, it's like 1.5 billion students worldwide at all levels, and just short of 100 million teachers. So it's huge. And this makes me wonder if it's not just with its size and potential actually drastically contributing to expanding these other systems, generic systems, and perpetuating their well-documented risks that are already there. Emma already mentioned the concerns around intellectual and copyright violations. Privacy concerns are also well documented, so people need to be really careful what they actually enter into these systems, because the entered data is saved there forever and contributes to further training the systems. People have talked already about algorithmic bias that's there, but also other risks. I think Ben had that in one of his slides around content moderation and exploitation of precarious workers from the global south, including in training these models, as well as this sort of, catastrophizing and the discourse of AI panic, which can distract us from thinking this through. And I'm not really sure that, saying that students and staff should be aware of this is enough if at the same time they are encouraged to use these generic tools, perhaps, and experiment with them. What can they do, in their everyday practice, even if they are aware of these issues? And should the onus actually be on individuals or small institutions? And then this makes me think, if generative AI is going to be developed specifically for education, then I really do think we must find ways to discuss internationally by whom would it be developed and with what motivation, based on which data and material. How can people who created this data for training have a say if they want to contribute at all, and specifically with which of their products? What rights would they have? How is the design, development, and innovation process going to be monitored, and by whom? How is the impact going to be evaluated and also acted upon? Because once things are integrated into omnipresent and everyday platforms, it's really hard to stop their usage. Who is going to pay for developing such systems, and with what? Who's going to finance with money, with data, but also who's going to pay with potential risk and harm? And can we find collective and democratic decision-making about all of this? And again, at which scale? Would it be better to have one global large system or several smaller ones? Akin to what was mentioned in the previous panel with small communities and smaller models to nourish like local knowledge and language. So, just to conclude, I think that these are very complex and nuanced issues that must have time to be carefully addressed and unpacked before this sort of taken for granted use cases are already launched out there that Ben talked about. That's already happening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anya. And just thinking about what we've heard and what we've learned so far, one of my professors used to say that if you came away from a session, more confused than when you went in, it was a good sign, because it was a sign that you were learning. So I can only speak for myself and say, this is, there's already so much, and I think so many other questions have been put on a table, as well as sharing, some work based on our research and our professional practice that we've been doing. So I really, thank you all for that initial couple of rounds. Let's see, because I know that we've had some questions in the chat. So I'm going to just, I've been sent a couple to share with you, and we'll have a look at the other ones. Of course, panelists, if you see other questions there, or if you want to respond to something else that one of the other panelists said, let's try to make this, we can try to go for a bit more conversational as well. But I see a question here from Wangpo Tenzin, asking what are the check and balance considerations needed to ensure an ethical behavior of AI users. So this is, perhaps linking a little bit to what Janja was talking about, the sort of end user part and how we train them. So would anybody like to take that one up? And here I would just invite you to unmute.
Maybe I can just make a comment or two. I think it's a really important question, because we tend to, even when we worked on the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, we emphasized that we need to reflect ethically on AI systems' impact on societies right through the life cycle. And then we always come to use and end of use at the end, research, design, development, deployment, use, and end of use. But we really, I don't think we stand still enough on, what would be ethical behavior from user side. So I think this is a really good question. And for me, I think it would be not to perpetuate bias. It would be to evaluate the outcomes that are generated, and to evaluate what you do with the tools that you decide to engage with. What is it? What is your goal with engaging with AI applications? And to consider the impact, and to consider whether you are perpetuating, as I said, bias. But then we need skills also. So users need to be aware. And, I really think that the secret weapon of AI ethicists is civil society. We need to educate civil society to be aware and to be AI literate. If we think about critical AI literacy, and also to understand that ethics is not about telling people what the right thing to do is, because the right thing to do differs. And it differs from context, from domain. The right thing to do in healthcare is not the right thing to do in agriculture. So, people love to go all crazy about ethical relativism, but, it just goes, without saying that you have to be domain specific and you have to be regional specific. But so what is needed is ethical reasoning skills, identifying ethical dilemmas, seeing whether these are practical dilemmas or whether these are just, so do we just have to wait for the technology to mature, in other words? So it's not really a dilemma. Or is it a dilemma that we now really have to look at the options on the table and then be able to reason towards the best option at the time in that domain? And we don't do that. In South Africa, there is a lot of talk about introducing coding to primary schools. And that's a good thing. But it's not a good thing. It's a terrible thing if it's done in a vacuum. If these children are not also given education in critical AI literacy skills, I think we are, we are maybe, going down a dangerous road. But yeah, let me give the others. I'm sure the others can give better answers than I can. Thanks.
I'm sure, Emma, they will all be equally good. Raïssa, Yanya, would you like to come in on that question, or should we move to the next question?
Can I just jump in? Thanks, Sam. I agree with everything you said. But just to add, what comes to my mind is Casey Fissler wrote about ethical debt of actually developers and companies too. So, you know, I mean, I agree that the end users of various technologies have to have critical thinking skills and be mindful about what they do and use it ethically. But at the same time, we should also be really mindful about the need for ethical development as well. So Casey talks about the ethical debt akin to technical debt. So when technology is released into use into the world too soon, without proper safety and so on, and then it needs to be updated, and then the costs that come with this. But in the sense, the ethical debt then works where in this race for competitiveness or profit, developers haven't really thought about properly about the potential misuse and the potential risk, and then actually think about what they can do in advance to mitigate that against that risk. So you know, it is about the end users, but not only. How can we think about this in a bigger sense as well?
And Yanya, and also colleagues as well, when you've mentioned, you know, specific people or documents or tools, you know, do feel free to, if you have a moment, to type them into the chat as well, so we could share the resources. Raïssa, would you like to come in on this first question about the ethical behavior of AI users?
Yeah, I totally agree with Emma and Yanya. You know, in Africa or in our country, you know, the first thing that we are very keen or excited about technology, you know, it was the first time for our schools, our students to have a PC to use the tutor virtual, you know, very exciting, it was so cool. And we need immediately also to think about these ethical guidelines, you know, this ethical thoughts. So we need to train our teacher about using the technology, but also critical thinking, to develop those technical culture, and that's, you know, for Ministry of Education, it's a lot of challenges, and it really takes many times, really takes many resources. So when we think about all our guidelines or our policy, let's take it to the ground and say, okay, in fact, how could the inspector, how could the Ministry of Education, how the teacher will do, how we will train them, how we will support them, how we will make sure that they can use those technology with all our ethical guidance. So very important that we keep, you know, down to earth and to see how in practice we could do that in the country, in the very difficulties of situation of our local context here.
Sure. Great. Thank you, everybody. Now, Rabab El-Gendi has put 2 questions in the chat. And I think we will take the first one and see how we do for time. So the question here is, what measures and policies need to be taken to ensure that generative AI in education works equitably and fairly for all students, regardless of their social, cultural, and economic backgrounds? I think that's a nice connection with many of the points that have already been made. Raïssa, you know, I know you've just sort of responded to the other question, but would you like to take a go at that one? I think it might be helpful, seeing as you've, you know, had this direct experience of implementing tools for teachers.
In DRC or in our different French-speaking countries, before coming to generative artificial intelligence, we already have this problem of equity, you know, access to all students to quality education in our country. That's already a big problem. So talking about artificial intelligence, you know, seems sometimes for ministry to be something like, you know, we have so much other problems to deal with instead of that. But definitely the world is changing. And I think that generative artificial intelligence will be good to improve quality of education in our country. So I think that we need to do exactly the same that what you are doing. We are not we will not refrain ourselves because we cannot give access to everybody in our entire country because of this so much difference of situation between the different schools or province. But it's important for our government to have a plan to say, okay, today we will do that. Here we will, after 1 year, 2 year, 3, we will provide this. We will train our teachers. We will equip our schools with the necessary materials to do that. We will work with African developers to make sure that they develop, or international developers, just to make sure that they develop tools that are locally contextualized. But we need plan, very structured plan. We need to have, but it will take time, and we need to deal with the other region who we do not have access to quality education, and we do not have access to generative AI. So it's in Africa, it's quite complex.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you have 54 countries with myriad cultures, languages, histories, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I appreciate you making that point a lot. It reminds me also of the most recent Global Education Monitoring Report, again, to come out of UNESCO, which had as its topic, coincidentally, for this period in which generative AI has, blown up, on technology and education. And, the big headline that got picked up from that was about, we really need to be thinking about whether adding technology into our schools is, as you said, Raïssa, before, is it a panacea, or is it doing something that's useful for our students and for our teachers and for our communities? So, perhaps we'll try to put a link to the GEM report into the chat as well. Before doing so Emma and Yanya, would you like to respond to Rabab's question about equity and fairness for students?
If I may, I just quickly want to say, this might sound very negative, but I don't think we can ensure that generative AI works equitably and fairly for all students. And it relates definitely to what Raïssa said, to access, but it also relates to the data that these models are trained on. So I think the way to address this is twofold. One is to become an activist for funding for quality data practices in countries such as mine, South Africa, and across the global South. I'm trying to get the financial sector in South Africa to make available funding and to fund, for instance, natural language processing research in indigenous languages, because the issue is also, it's the access, it's the data, and it's also the fact that different, that there are always shared values, but there are also cultural differences. So it is important also to not just want to have, I'm not saying with working equitably and fairly, we mean that we will have a monolithic kind of output, but understand that there will always be nuances, and rather try and make the different nuances stronger in their own right. And the second thing, just in a sentence, something that angers me tremendously is to hear people say that generative AI will give students in Africa who do not have access to quality education immediate access to quality education. There's firstly the infrastructure issues that Raïssa pointed out. But secondly, there are the concerns around the quality of the output of these models. So is it okay that Africa always has secondhand knowledge? So our children must be grateful that they have something at least. And so again, for me, it is important to make civil society aware of these kinds of ways of speaking, and also of the hype that is people are told this by whom? By OpenAI. So we have to really think hard about these issues, and we have to protect ourselves here on this part of the world and strengthen our capacity, because we do have it. We just have other obstacles to overcome. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's a really, really important point. Thank you very much. Okay. Janja, would you like to follow?
I disagree very much, so I can refrain.
Yeah. Okay. I think we are unfortunately just about at time. Somebody from hello, Moira. Are we going to have to wrap up because I do know we have some other questions?
If we could, please, I do apologize.
Okay. No, and I apologize to the people who posted questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, but we managed to start with 2 really good and engaging questions, so that took up the time that we had. Well, listen, I'm going to pass it back to Moira, who I think is going to close off the whole event, but let me just take a moment to thank Emma, Raïssa, Janja for really bringing, such expertise, but also different perspectives, looking at similar questions in a way. I think it's always so important that we put these together. So thank you also to NORRAG for creating such an excellent panel. Thank you to the speakers for being ready, brilliantly prepared, and absolutely punctual with your timing. Excellent. Thank you again. Over to you, Moira.
Thank you.
And thank you, Emma, and also Radhika for chairing and moderating those 2 fascinating panels with great respect for time and participation and the issues being raised. So thank you of course, to all of our panelists and our keynote speaker. And there is a large amount of public writing, as we've seen today, about as Ben described it, technicolored promise of AI for supporting social inclusion, freeing up researchers from grunt work, the top X AI tools for teachers. And what is less well understood, and what we tried to address in this AI and Digital Inequities Summit, and I think our panelists and our keynote really got to the key point of so many of the issues around what's less well understood about where this so-called AI comes from and whose oppression, past, present, and future, is needed for it to succeed, and how it is that it may or may not actually contribute to widening existing inequities in education, rather than actually addressing them positively. And this has truly been a fascinating discussion on what learners and teachers can do, and also the role for civil society and researchers in these questions, and also what needs to be done by national governments and global actors to regulate AI ethically, with respect for justice and for knowledge equity. And all that is left for me to say is to say thank you to the Centre for Sociodigital Futures for co-sponsoring this event with us. Thank you to all of you who've been with us today. You will all receive a recording of this, an events highlight, and we would very